My in-laws hosted a VIP-only garden party, locking the gate when I arrived. "You're not on the list anymore." I'd gifted the landscaping, so I arranged for the crew to reclaim the plants mid-event, turning their elegant affair into a muddy mess. I, 34M, thought I'd seen petty before. I was wrong. The gate didn't budge when I pushed it. That was the first sign something had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Behind the ornate iron bars, I could see the garden I'd paid for, every flowering shrub, every imported rose bush, every carefully placed stone pathway. My money had transformed their bland backyard into something worthy of a magazine spread. Now they were using it to lock me out. My mother-in-law appeared on the other side, her expression carefully neutral in that way wealthy people perfect when they're about to say something cruel. She informed me through the bars that I wasn't on the guest list anymore. The clipboard in her hands had names highlighted in yellow marker. Mine, apparently, had been crossed out. I asked if this was some kind of joke. She assured me it wasn't. The party was VIP only now, she explained, and given recent circumstances, I no longer qualified. Behind her, I could see my wife moving through clusters of guests, laughing at something someone said. She saw me at the gate. Our eyes met. She turned away. That's when I understood. The divorce papers I'd filed 2 weeks ago had clearly made the rounds. Somehow, I'd become the villain in whatever story they'd constructed. The landscaping project had been my idea 6 months earlier. My father-in-law had mentioned wanting to upgrade their backyard for their annual summer party, and I'd volunteered to handle everything. Not just funding it, actually managing the entire operation. I'd spent weeks researching, meeting with designers, selecting plants that would thrive in their specific soil conditions. The bill had come to $43,000. I'd written the check without hesitation because that's what family did, or so I believed. The crew had transformed the space into something genuinely beautiful. Mature olive trees flanked the entrance. A wisteria arbor created a natural tunnel leading to the patio. Beds of lavender and rosemary released fragrance with every breeze. The centerpiece was a Japanese maple I'd sourced from a specialty nursery 3 states away, its deep red leaves providing a stunning focal point. My in-laws had been thrilled. My mother-in-law had actually hugged me, telling me I was the son she'd never had. That memory felt poisonous now, standing outside their locked gate like some unwanted solicitor. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat, watching well-dressed guests arrive and get waved through immediately. A terrible idea began forming in my mind. Terrible, petty, and absolutely perfect. The landscaping company answered on the second ring. I'd kept the project manager's number saved because we'd talked about potential spring additions. I explained that I needed to speak with him urgently about the property I'd hired them for. He remembered me immediately, asked if something was wrong with the installation. I told him nothing was wrong with his work, which was true. His crew had been meticulous, but I had a rather unusual request, and I was willing to pay premium rates for immediate service. What I proposed clearly caught him off guard. There was a long silence on the line before he asked me to repeat myself. I did. I explained that I'd personally funded the entire project, had receipts for everything, and my name was on all the contracts as the client. The property owners had simply provided the location. Legally, I wanted to explore my options regarding reclaiming the materials. He said he'd need to check with his lawyer, but off the record, if I had documentation proving I'd paid for everything, the plants were technically mine. The installation had been a service I'd purchased, but the materials themselves belonged to whoever bought them. He'd heard of similar situations in messy divorces before. I told him I was in the middle of exactly such a divorce. He called back 17 minutes later. His lawyer had confirmed that with proper documentation, I could reclaim property I'd purchased. However, he strongly suggested I have law enforcement present to prevent any disputes. I thanked him and said I'd handle that part. Then I asked about his crew's availability for an emergency removal. Today, I clarified. Right now? Within the next 2 hours. The price he quoted was outrageous. I agreed immediately. The non-emergency police line connected me to an officer who listened to my situation with what sounded like barely contained amusement. He confirmed that if I could prove ownership of the items and wanted them removed from property I didn't own, I was within my rights. Someone would meet me at the location to ensure everything remained civil. I gathered every receipt, every invoice, every email confirmation from my home office. The paper trail was immaculate because I treated the project like the business investment I'd thought it was, an investment in family relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. The landscaping crew arrived first, 3 trucks pulling up to the curb outside my in-laws' house. The project manager stepped out and reviewed my documentation on the hood of his truck. He nodded, satisfied, and briefed his team. They began unloading equipment, shovels, tarps, a small excavator they'd brought for the mature trees. The police officer arrived minutes later, a middle-aged woman with a name badge reading Officer Chen. She examined my papers, asked a few clarifying questions, then radioed to another unit for backup given the size of the operation. She advised me that if anyone tried to physically prevent the removal, I should not engage and let her handle it. I agreed. I wasn't planning to engage at all. I was planning to watch. The crew approached the gate, and I pressed the call button on the intercom system. My father-in-law's voice crackled through, asking who it was. I identified myself and informed him that I was there with a landscaping crew to remove property that belonged to me. The line went silent for several seconds before he responded that I needed to leave immediately or he'd call the police. I told him the police were already here and suggested he come to the gate. Officer Chin took over at that point, explaining through the intercom that I had documentation proving ownership of the landscaping materials and was exercising my legal right to remove them. She recommended he cooperate to avoid any escalation. The gate opened. My father-in-law stood there, his face an alarming shade of red, with my mother-in-law beside him looking like she'd been slapped. Behind them, the party had gone quiet. 50-some guests were all staring toward the commotion. My father-in-law demanded to see my so-called proof. Officer Chun presented the documentation. He flipped through pages, his expression moving from outrage to confusion to something resembling panic. He tried arguing that I'd gifted the landscaping, that it had been a present, but I'd been careful never to frame it that way. Every email referred to it as something I was handling or managing. Never once had I used the word gift. My mother-in-law was saying something about family and decency and how I was ruining everything. I pointed out the irony of her lecturing me about family while I stood outside the gate she'd locked me out of. Her mouth snapped shut. Officer Chin asked if they were going to prevent the crew from accessing the property. My father-in-law looked at the officer, at the documentation, at the crew with their equipment, and seemed to deflate. He stepped aside. What happened next was methodical chaos. The crew had done this work countless times, but in reverse. They moved with practiced efficiency, starting with the smaller plantings. The rosemary bushes came up first, root balls wrapped in burlap. The lavender beds followed. Guests scattered from the patio area as workers moved in with shovels. My wife finally approached me, her face pale. She asked what I thought I was doing. I told her I was reclaiming my property, exactly as I'd told her father. She said this was insane, that I was embarrassing everyone. I reminded her that she'd stood there watching while her mother turned me away at the gate like I was nobody. She tried to argue that I should have called first, worked something out. I asked what there was to work out. She'd made her choice about which side she was on when she filed the counterpetition 3 days after I'd initiated divorce proceedings. Everything that happened today was simply clarification. She walked away without another word. The Japanese maple required the excavator. The machine carved into the lawn, digging around the root system while guests abandoned the garden entirely, retreating to the house's interior. Mud sprayed from the treads. The careful groundwork that had created level pathways began to collapse as heavy equipment compressed the soil. What had been an elegant garden party was rapidly becoming a construction site. My mother-in-law returned, this time threatening to sue me for property damage. Officer Chin calmly explained that the damage was occurring in the process of removing items I owned, and that I was not responsible for restoring the property to its previous condition. If anything, my in-laws should be grateful I wasn't charging them for the months of use they'd gotten from my landscaping. That's when my mother-in-law started crying. Actual tears. She told me I was cruel, that I'd changed, that the man she'd welcomed into their family would never do something like this. I considered reminding her that the man she'd welcomed into her family also wouldn't have been barred from a party at the gate, but I stayed quiet. Some points didn't need making. The olive trees were the most dramatic. They'd been the anchoring elements of the design, their silvery leaves and gnarled trunks suggesting Mediterranean elegance. Removing them left gaping holes in the ground, raw earth exposed where there had been beauty. The crew worked in pairs, one steadying the tree while another operated the excavator. A few guests had come back outside to watch, unable to resist the spectacle. I recognized some of them, family friends, business associates of my father-in-law, people I'd shared meals with. None of them approached me. They stood in small clusters, phones out, probably texting each other about the drama unfolding. The wisteria arbor came down next. It had been trained over a wooden structure, the vines carefully woven through the lattice. Removing it meant dismantling the arbor entirely. More damage to the lawn as the posts came up, concrete footings breaking through the surface. By this point, the garden looked like a disaster zone. Muddy trenches crisscrossed where there had been paths. The patio area was tracked with dirt. Piles of removed plants sat on tarps, waiting to be loaded onto the trucks. The pristine space I'd created had been systematically erased. My father-in-law stood on the patio, staring at the destruction with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or the dawning realization of consequences. He'd spent decades in business, built a successful company on negotiation and relationships. He understood leverage. He'd just never expected his son-in-law to use any. The removal took 3 hours total. The crew was thorough, taking everything down to the decorative stones I'd had installed along the pathways. Those went into buckets, loaded into the trucks with everything else. When they finished, the backyard looked worse than before I'd started the original project. At least then it had been bland, but functional. Now it was a muddy wasteland dotted with holes and tire tracks. Officer Chin approached me as the crew finished loading the last items. She mentioned that in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like this. She couldn't officially condone what I'd done, but off the record, she hoped my in-laws learned something about treating people decently. I thanked her for her help and her discretion. The project manager gave me an estimate for storage costs until I decided what to do with everything. I told him to sell whatever he could and donate the rest to a public park or community garden. I didn't want any of it. The money had never been the point. As the trucks pulled away, I stood at the still open gate for a moment, looking at what remained. The party was ruined beyond recovery. Guests were already leaving, their elegant afternoon destroyed. My wife stood on the patio next to her parents, all three of them staring at me with identical expressions of disbelief. I didn't feel victorious exactly. I felt something cleaner than that. Something like equilibrium restored. Update 1. The fallout started immediately. Text messages from extended family members began arriving before I'd even made it home. My wife's aunt wanted to know if I'd lost my mind. Her uncle threatened legal action. Various cousins weighed in with opinions ranging from horror to, surprisingly, a few messages of barely concealed approval. My wife sent a long message around midnight. She explained that her parents were devastated, that I'd humiliated them in front of their closest friends, that there was no coming back from this. I replied that there'd been no coming back from the moment they locked me out of a party I'd made possible. She didn't respond. The social media fallout was predictable. My mother-in-law posted vague comments about family betrayal and showed selected photos of the destroyed garden. Several people commented with sympathy before someone who'd apparently been at the party explained what had actually happened. That thread got messy fast, with guests chiming in about how they'd seen me turned away at the gate before the landscaping crew arrived. My father-in-law called 3 days later. The conversation was brief. He acknowledged that perhaps they'd handled the party invitation poorly, but my response had been disproportionate and vindictive. I pointed out that disproportionate was spending $43,000 on someone else's property and then being treated like an outsider. He had no response to that. The divorce proceedings accelerated. My wife's lawyer tried to argue that the landscaping removal demonstrated unstable behavior and should impact the settlement. My lawyer countered with documentation showing I'd been explicitly excluded from a family event despite my contributions, which demonstrated their side's hostility. The judge seemed more annoyed by the entire situation than sympathetic to either party. Update 2. The property value of my in-laws' house became relevant when they tried to claim I'd damaged their investment. An appraiser determined that the current condition of the backyard had actually decreased the home's value by approximately $30,000 compared to when the landscaping was installed. Their lawyer tried to pursue damages, but my lawyer pointed out that I'd removed my own property and had no obligation to maintain or restore their land. The case went nowhere. Turned out that letting someone install landscaping on your property without a written agreement about ownership was legally murky enough that neither side wanted to push it further. Meanwhile, the story had spread through our social circle like a virus. People were choosing sides, which meant my wife and I lost mutual friends regardless of the outcome. Some saw me as justified. Others thought I'd crossed a line. Most just seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation and wanted distance from the drama. My wife's younger sister reached out privately. She told me she'd always thought her parents treated their kids' partners like employees who could be dismissed at will. Watching me actually enforce boundaries had been satisfying, even if she couldn't say so publicly. She apologized for the gate incident and said she'd argued against it, but been overruled. I appreciated the honesty. The divorce finalized 4 months after the garden party. The settlement was cleaner than expected, probably because neither side wanted to extend the process. My wife kept the house we'd shared. I kept my retirement accounts and business interests. We split everything else down the middle. I haven't spoken to my former in-laws since the removal. From what I've heard through the grapevine, they hired a different landscaping company to restore their backyard. The new design is apparently much simpler, more budget-friendly. They learned something after all, just not the lesson they'd expected. My ex-wife sent one final message 6 months post-divorce. She admitted that her parents had pushed her to exclude me from family events once the divorce papers were filed, believing it would be too awkward otherwise. She'd gone along with it because fighting them was exhausting. She understood now that the gate incident had been a breaking point, and she was sorry for her part in it. I didn't respond. Some apologies come too late to matter. Looking back, I don't regret the garden removal. People called it petty, vindictive, excessive. Maybe it was all those things. But there's something clarifying about the moment when you realize that being accommodating and generous has been mistaken for being weak and disposable. The locked gate wasn't just about one party. It was the crystallization of years of subtle dismissals, of my contributions being taken for granted, of my place in the family being conditional on my usefulness. They wanted to strip away my access while keeping the benefits I'd provided. I simply corrected the imbalance. The Japanese maple ended up in a community park about 20 miles from my new apartment. I drive past it sometimes. It's thriving, its red leaves bright against the green surroundings. People sit beneath it on benches, enjoying shade they don't know I provided. That feels more meaningful than anything I'd built for my former in-laws. I've started dating again, cautiously. When new people ask about my divorce, I keep it simple. I tell them it ended badly, that family dynamics got complicated, that I learned valuable lessons about boundaries and self-respect. If they press for details, I mention that my ex-in-laws once locked me out of a party at a house with a garden I'd paid for. The ones who immediately ask what I did next are the ones I don't see again. The ones who wince in sympathy and say that must have been horrible, those are the ones worth getting to know. These days, I rent an apartment with a small balcony. I've started growing herbs in containers, nothing elaborate. Basil, mint, cilantro. Things I can actually use. The scale is manageable, the investment purely for myself. When something grows, I'm the only one who benefits. When something dies, I'm the only one affected. It's a better arrangement all around. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.